Okay, recording week 2, Wednesday group. We're at Largo, Argentina. The sacred area of Largo, Argentina, more specifically. Okay, since there's here, just pop up here so you might as well come all the way up so you can see something. Okay, now first of all, the area that we're in was excavated as we see it today in the 1920s. The 1920s, which era is that? Anybody remember? Fascist. The fascist era, very good. And in fact, that was the era when there was a great deal of urban renewal. I think I mentioned that last week. And modernizing, you could say. And a lot of it had to do, well, not a lot of it, but definitely there was an aspect of that had to do with the ideology of the fascist era that based itself on what heritage? Do you remember? What was it based on for kind of the Roman Empire? Yes. So the idea being, using that glorious past as a buttress to its own legitimacy and ideology and so on. So part of that policy was translated into this urban renewal because the idea was, if you had to choose in the fascist era, if you were going to have a big piazza all illuminated, what would you want in the middle of it? Roman temples or an old medieval church? Which one do you think they'd want more of? The temples, things like that. And that's exactly what they did in Rome. So you'll find throughout the city certain areas where temples are ruins are more highly visible in this kind of sense, with traffic going around them. Various archaeological sites. A good example is the mausoleum of the Emperor Augustus, which we'll be seeing eventually. And again, it's built. They build around it the rationalist fascist architecture. It becomes contextualized in that sense, and that's what's happened here. That's what we see here. So in fact, where we see the platforms, the bases of 4 temples that are known primarily as A, B, C, and D, because it's hypothetical for the most part to what deities they were attributed to. Over the many, many centuries, there were all kinds of other structures that had been built within them and on top of them. And so here we also see this dramatic difference in the ground level. And I think I've mentioned this before, this kind of rule of thumb of Rome. The further down you go, which way in time are you going? Into the past. All right? So the further down you go, the further back in time. And we start here today because this is about as far back as our course will go, which is, although I mentioned prehistoric, and I mentioned the era of Romans monarchy, tribal kings. What was the era, do you remember, that comes after the tribal kings? But before the empire? The Republic. What did you say?
I said historic.
Well, yeah, historic, yeah. Well, of course it also is because there's written records. So this is indeed the Republican era. So that's why we start here. So the Republican era shares with the empire certainly architectural sophistication and so on. A big change would be a question of degree, because when we get to the empire, it's all much more expanded, much more ambitious, spend a lot more money. The Republican era, generally speaking, is certainly more austere. You have a mentality of collective identity and yeoman farmers. When the summons comes, they throw down their plows and pick up their swords and armor and horses and come together to fight for Rome's interests. And this is throughout, of course, primarily the area around Rome, and then ultimately over centuries throughout Italy and then beyond Italy. And these are the Romans that will build a navy, learn to operate it, ultimately defeat the Carthaginians, the Punic Wars. You might have heard of Hannibal, things like that. So it's a time of great victories and expansion, but it's not with any kind of king or monarchical type figure. And in those centuries, the 3rd century BC, the 2nd century BC, the interaction with Greece is primary, right? So you have an enormous amount of Greek art, architecture, culture that's literally transported into Rome, where statues and things are just wholesale brought in and put on display. So Roman culture with a big C, the idea of an artistic kind of culture was minimal, I guess we could say, before Roman expansion and the Greek influence. Roman martial culture, Roman culture in other ways, of course, was as rich as any society, but the artistic culture that we think of didn't exist until it was really imported in, right? And so these temples from that period, of course, take their cue, their influence from the Greeks before them, or at the same time, because of course Greece by this time already was filled with the wonderful temples and so on. Okay? Now, like everywhere in Rome, it's been through many periods, many fires, of a 4th century fire, a 2nd century fire, and during those kinds of destructions of the areas, and that's also true of Nero's time in the empire, the ground level raises. So look right here, where this temple, which I believe this is Temple A. I can't remember if the order is A, B, C, D, going from north to south, or if it's A, B, C, D going from south to north. But we're on the north side, and I believe this is A. And the stairway that you see that's partially restored, it goes below the pavement. So what does that tell us? Which of the two is more recent, the pavement or the temple foundation there? Which is newer? Is that my question? Yeah, that's right. That's a later pavement. That's a later pavement. The earlier pavement was made of tufa, which is this dark green volcanic stone. You can see some bits that are. So, tells us something about this temple. We see pretty rudimentary local materials. The tufa stone, the carved columns there, also made out of tufa, which is locally procured. The white porous stone we're also standing at. Remember what that's called? It's made what they made the Colosseum out of. It's still being quarried. Starts with a T. Close. Good, Oliver. Travertine. Travertine. Remember the materials. Keep in mind as we go forward over the course that you want to kind of create in your notes and maybe back pages and somewhere categories. So one category is materials. And last week I introduced the first one, travertine. Today I've now mentioned the second one, tufa. And these are building stones, locally procured building stones. Then the other categories, as we've seen, are historical periods, artistic periods and so on, and architectural names. Remember last week I mentioned the top of a temple with its triangular roof. Remember what that's called? A tympanum. Tympany or tympanum. So you'll be accumulating over the course these various categories of definitions. Okay. Now, the last thing I'll say here, the round temple is the goddess of fortune, and the reason we know this is because of the statue that was found, her head, which is on display in a museum in Rome. Okay. Now, fortune. Fortune meaning fate, destiny, good fortune. Now there's all kinds of fortune, isn't there? There's good luck or bad luck in life, in business, in in love and personal affairs. So every one of those categories that you can imagine of experience takes on a certain definition as for the goddess. So the goddess of fortune in love, and these other specific details. And that's a typical part of the Roman religion, is the specificity of various life phenomena, life activities, life experiences, having a characteristic, a personality, a name given to it. Okay? The Roman world, their religion, of course, enveloped them. It was in everything. It was in time, and of course, in the past and in the future, and in everyday life. Primarily, an important characteristic is ancestor worship. Right? So typical Romans would have in their home a little altar with figurines, and these were venerated and prayed to, and offerings were made to them to look out for the well-being of the family. Right? So that's one kind of religious practice. Then you have these various gods and goddesses. And a good way of thinking of it is a term that you'll be quizzed on called numen. And numen, N-U-M-E-N, numen are the spirits within nature, right? The numen originally in the most primeval period would have been thunder, clouds, noises in the forest. Those, imagine, early man and those mysteries, and giving them a name to try to give them some kind of comprehension, some kind of identity, right? In order to, I suppose you could say, cope with them. But numen, over time, will go far beyond natural phenomena such as lightning or whatever, and every aspect, like I said, luck, death, birth, marriage, business, and naturally agriculture probably would be one of the even earlier ones. So going from numen, which are more abstract, to gods and goddesses and all kinds of other spirit kind of entities with names and characteristics, that's a huge part of the Roman religious worldview, right? So they categorize everything, giving them identities, right? And fortune, the goddess of fortune, is a good example of that. Then there's other gods that are more relatable, perhaps, because of their stories, their myths, like Hercules, which everybody's heard of. And Hercules is like is like our Superman, human, half god, gets into all kinds of trouble, suffers great adversity, does terrible things, kills his family under a spell. So he's saddled with enormous emotional pathos. That's a good word to remember, pathos, P-A-T-H-O-S, meaning emotional power, emotional charge. Like an opera where everybody dies at the end, you could say it's filled with pathos, or a romantic book or something. So Hercules is a great example of a mythological figure with great pathos, and as a result, let's wait for the siren to stop. Okay, and as a result, having pathos, suffering adversity, overcoming adversity, all of those characteristics of the hero archetype. Archetype is a word that you never want to forget. It of course comes out of the Jungian psychology. Archetype is A-R-C-H-T-Y-P-E-E. So an archetype is kind of an example that's applicable in many different situations. So again, being a human archetype, being a hero, suffering adversity, is something everybody can identify with, right? And so here's another aspect of their religion, where a religious figure can give comfort to people through being able to relate to him or her, because naturally there are feminine deities with feminine characteristics that more likely a female would relate to than a man, generally speaking. Of course, these are always just generalizations, but overall we could say that, I think we could safely say that's true. So here's another characteristic. So what have we talked about? The idea of Newman, phenomena coming out of nature, the categorization of every imaginable phenomena, natural and human, giving them identities, right? And then praying to them or sacrificing to them for their favor. And then other religious mythological figures that provide examples of that humans can relate to, like Hercules. And lastly, and this is very important, this is a defining feature of Roman religion, is the very highly organized ceremonial aspect, codified and precise. For example, a sacrifice to a certain god at a certain time of year, at a preordained time regarding maybe celestial indications, and it has to be done in just exactly the correct way. And then, for example, the sacrifice might include, like, let's say it's the sacrifice of a bull, and then they cut out its liver, they carefully examine the liver, and the qualities of that liver would give indications of the future. Is it an auspicious period or not? Augurs. And an augur is the person who can tell the future regarding these kinds of indications. It could be the flight of birds, or, as I said, reading the signs of a liver. A-U-G-U-R, an augur. And just like, and the auspices. And auspices means, like we say, this is an auspicious occasion, meaning it's a good occasion. But the auspices are the indications that these phenomena can tell us. So the auspices, A-U-S-P-I-C-E-S, auspices. Right? So highly codified ceremonies that had to be practiced carefully and to the letter in order to please the gods. That is a very important definition of a characteristic of Roman religion. Okay, so make sure you write that down. Question?
Can you say that one more time?
Can I say that one more time? Religious practices and ceremonies were highly codified and rigid ceremonies. So, another way, the ceremonial aspect and its rigid practice is a big part of the Roman religion. Okay, so there's different ways of saying the same thing, but that all again is a character. So now I've given you kind of several characteristics of the Roman religion, which can help you understand. I think that can answer a question why. Look at how many temples there are throughout Rome, because there's a whole lot of deities, and then there were a lot of small temples and little sacred areas. I think I mentioned last week about how sacred groves transformed into temples over time, trees becoming columns and things like that. And then one thing that we'll see throughout Rome, I don't know if we can see one from here, I don't see one right now, but you have what are called edicola. So write this down, it's an important word, edicola, E-D-I-C-U-L-A, edicola. It's kind of a small altar. It also happens to be the Italian word for the newsstands. Those are also called edicola, because I suppose there's something in common of the idea of a little kind of a box or whatever. And the edicola, in fact, I figured you'd be able to see one from here because they're just everywhere. If you look just beyond that tram that's passing across from us, and you see the tram wires that above its roof, and there's a window, and then you can see a little object and a little awning protecting it. We'll walk over and see it. But what that is a Christian edicola. It's got, see it's moving now? Well, I can't see it close enough, but that's probably exactly what you'll see in every street corner. They're all over trust everywhere where you're living, right? So these they usually show the Madonna and Child, and so that's the Christian version. They're looking out over the neighborhood and protecting the neighborhood. The same way in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, every business practice, every different kind of guild, such as painters or shoemakers or architects or whoever it was, builders, stonecutters, they all had their patrons, doctors, they all had their patron saint. So again, there's a categorization in a similar way to what we see in pagan Rome. So Catholicism, there's no question, reflects enormously its pagan roots as well as its Greek roots as well as its Hebrew roots. The idea of a multiplicity of figures that each represent a different characteristic of the religion. So you have the different saints. Probably a big difference would be that, you know, saints generally are martyrs, right? They all suffer for their Christian beliefs, following in the footsteps of Christ. And that's certainly not true of pagan deities. But what is similar is how they become patron saints of different activities. And the idea, as I said, of the numen becoming divinities that reflect different activities. Okay, so you guys have any questions all about that? That's like kind of the basic lecture that more or less the same thing that I did on Monday. Basic ideas about religion, and you want to keep those characteristics in mind regarding the numerous temples and, as I said, these edicula from the Christian period. One additional thing, and this is important too, is in the Empire period, emperors and other figures of the elite are often, not always, deified as well. So emperors end up being raised up to godhood, such as a great example is, you know, Augustus or something like that, right? Now that would have been unheard of in the Republic, because the Republic, as we said, is a much more down-to-earth, rough period of austerity, and the idea that you would make one of your fellow Romans, you might certainly venerate him as a hero and an example to be followed, but you wouldn't make him into a god. That was never would have happened, right? So it shows a different attitude. All right, I'm gonna put this on pause now. Any questions? Okay, now we're continuing in Via dei Barbieri. And you should take a picture of even these signs, you know, like that says Via dei Barbieri. That's a perfect thing to orient yourself, you know. They're wonderful, you know, it's kind of one of the characteristics of Rome, the little street signs. Via dei Barbieri. R stands for Rione. And what Roman numeral is that? No. The V, how much is a V? No.
5.
X is 10.
5.
5. 5 plus 3 is 8. It's Rione 8. And Rioni are, from the medieval era onwards, the divisions of the city areas. There were regiones, something similar in Augustan times. So every Rione has a name and a number. So that just shows you the neighborhood that we're in. So here in Via dei Barbieri, there's this massive, countless number of palazzi. So this palace that we stopped in front of also with the other group on Monday. This is clearly a palace of at least the 1600s. I don't know anything specific about it, but just looking at it, I would say it's probably from the second half of the 1500s. And the reason, and this is the same reason I stopped here with the other group, this magnificent entrance, this portal, and I would take pictures of it. I didn't tell the other group to, but now I'm telling you. And so large, because this is where carriages would come in. So here's a little parentheses about the Renaissance and the Baroque era. Remember those dates? What is approximately that, the Renaissance Baroque era? 1600s, right? And who's the ruler of Rome at that time? Not specifically, but in general. The church, and who's the leader of the church? The Pope, right? So the Pope is the ruler of that era. And remember, what does he rule? The Catholic Church. The Catholic Church is the center of religion of Europe. So you have a lot of ambassadors. You have a lot of representatives from other countries, right? And so you have a lot of aristocrats, right? Not just local, but also foreign. Representatives, powerful cardinals and so on, representatives of the King of France, Spain, and on and on and on. And all these people parade around Rome showing off their status. And one of the ways they do that is these massive, I think he wants to go in here. These massive carriages led by 4 horses or 6 horses, liveried drivers, you know, very elaborately decorated oftentimes. And of course, the fancier the carriage, the more horses, the more attendants, the higher your status that's indicated, right? So you can see examples of this in the Vatican. There's a whole section of Pope's vehicles, and you can see examples of these very fancy carriages that were specifically of the Pope. So what you're looking at here is a parking passage. This is the entrance for the parking, you know, for carriages. You know, they don't park outside; they go inside. So carriages would have come right in here. The owners of the palace, and the owners of the palace would have lived on this lower floor. Servants would have lived upstairs. Okay, so a reminder of a period when the status of these figures is important. Okay, in Via dei Barbieri. So now I'm going to stop. Okay, so now we've arrived in Largo del Pallaro, P-A-L-L-A-R-O, and you can see this panel right here, which you should take a picture of. I'm going to take a picture of it for everybody who can't see it with us right now. Unfortunately, it's half in the sun and half not, but it is what it is. And the reason I brought you over here is, again, a reminder of these various levels of Rome, right? And how they're reflected in what we see. And what do we see over here on my right? This dramatically curved building, right? Now, what is it built on, foundation-wise? Look right here. A theater. In Italian, the Teatro di Pompeo, the theater of Pompey, P-O-M-P-E-Y. Pompey was a significant general and a rival at certain points of Julius Caesar. So this is the 1st century BC. So what era is it still?
Roman Empire?
No, not yet. It's not. That's exactly why I'm mentioning it, because it's not the Roman Empire yet. It's late Republican Rome. The 1st century BC is the last century of what we consider the Republic, right? So the period of the rise of Caesar and all of the various conflicts of that time are late Republican, and they lead to the Emperor Augustus, which is Caesar's adopted son Octavius, and they lead to the empire. So Pompey, successful campaign, returns to Rome with a lot of money. What does he offer the Roman people? A theater. This is important because this is the first public theater, the first theater that's not the first public theater, but the first public permanent theater. Now, I've mentioned how the Republican period is more austere and hearty and simple. Well, again, the idea there too, that there would be theaters for frivolous, dramatical performances and those kind of entertainments would have not been acceptable. So what did Pompey do? Well, he made the theater, and what is a theater made of? You've got the seats, which are also steps, and they led at the top to a small temple that was the very top of this theater. So it was as if the theater seats were not theater seats, but steps leading up to a tiny temple at the top. And that was how he kind of circumvented the rule and got away with it. But the fact that he now builds a permanent theater is an indication to us of the wealth available, the organization, and the changing morals, where it would have just never been accepted a century earlier or earlier than that. And regarding what we see, and so take a lot of pictures of this indication, a building from the 1600s built on top using the foundations. And we'll see this again and again throughout Rome, where what was there before functions as a foundation, literally, for what comes later. Okay? So if you didn't take a picture, do so. And now let's go over here. And we're going to go into this little passageway, a shortcut. And the passageway was recently restored. And what do we see at the end? But a great example of one of these edicola with little candle offerings. So here you have a virgin and child, and this is exactly the kind of thing of the Christian era that you could say to some extent certainly reflects the pagan period before it, where Numen and Daemon and all kinds of little entities looked out over the different neighborhoods, and it all became generally the Virgin. And above this lovely painted passage, why, and this is just a brief parenthesis, but it's important because it'll come up, it's a big part of our course. Why did this painting survive? The technique that's used is fresco. And what is fresco? You know what the word fresco in Italian? It means fresh plaster, wet plaster. You apply plaster to a wall or a brick surface, a stone surface, and then you paint on it while it's wet. And the chemical reaction, the paint becomes carbon, it becomes the most permanent form of painting. So fresco is what Michelangelo uses in the Sistine Chapel. It'll come up a whole lot. It's a technique that goes back also to, of course, to ancient Rome, but it's preeminent in the Renaissance. And this lovely example that was clean. This is why a fresco such as this, it could have been plastered over, painted over, walled over, and they were able to remove any extra surfaces or dirt or soot, and the painting survives underneath. So it's a testament to how strong fresco is. Okay? And now let us proceed through here. It's called Passetto del Biscione. And now we're in Rione number 6. The passetto, meaning the little passage of Biscione, which I'm not sure what the etymology of Biscione is. And here, another characteristic of Renaissance and Baroque Rome is, and you could definitely attribute this certainly to status and expendable extra income, right? Look at this lovely house, definitely from the 1500s. Just a couple floors, 3 floors, right? And richly decorated. And again, another edicola, kind of looking benevolently over the neighborhood. Rome in those centuries was filled with frescoed facades and etched facades. Sometimes they were frescoes, sometimes they were etched, but they were obviously done with a technique that was, to some extent, weatherproofed. And there are many, many examples that you can still see. On the resources page, it's already been uploaded, a link to a very nice collection on a website. The website's in Italian, but it doesn't matter. Take a look at it and link it when you, for example, you'll take a picture of this and then upload on that in the description for that link on your Google map the link to that web page that I've given you, where there's countless other examples, and they're really beautiful, and you can also go visit them if you have that interest in stuff. So a characteristic of Rome of the Renaissance. Now, look at what happens as time goes by. You have more of a house-like structure, a larger building from obviously later, and then opposite here at number 95, an even larger building, because as time goes by and there's more wealth in the Baroque period, they build higher, add more stories for more to increase the property value. Obviously, just think of, why are the buildings so tall in New York City? Because limited property. The higher you go, the more space you have to rent out. Well, it's the same concept in Rome or any other city. You have a valuable piece of property, you build a taller building, you can fit more people in and make more money. So back in the 1500s and earlier, a more medieval structure like this building probably had a garden attached to it where the people had their own personal little vegetable garden and so on for their own use. There was a lot of that. Okay. Okay, I think I can stop this now for a few minutes. Okay, now we've just come around the corner from Campo dei Fiori and we're in Via dei Giubonari. I think it's Via dei Giubonari, which is a shopping street. A lot of, if you like that kind of thing, if you want to check out the shops sometime. And I just wanted to mention, and I'll take a picture of it, and you should too, one of the countless examples of the old Roman materials that were reused, right? And so you see these columns here that were obviously, what period do you think they're from when you look at them? Huh? Yeah, the Roman Empire or earlier. They could be certainly earlier. We've seen how sophisticated at the Largo Argentina temples of the Republic were, so they could be from the Republic as well. One way that to keep in mind that can help differentiate is not just the style but the material. So when you see some exotic Egyptian marble, then you could say, well, okay, that's definitely the Empire because they weren't importing those things during the Republic, right? So the materials as well as the style can help us understand the period. Now these right here, they could be either. My guess would be that it's Empire because the Ionic capitals are made of a clean white marble that could be Greek, but I don't know. We'd have to look into it. But more importantly, in the Middle Ages, these kind of structures or these kinds of materials are reused, and we see they were used for a building here, and then the building itself. The building itself could have been added later. It could be the original building. There could have been a different building. But typically in the Middle Ages, these kind of columns are set up as a portico. And later we see the shop, they were filled in, right? In the Middle Ages, the common residence, and this is true throughout Italy and elsewhere, is that downstairs you'd have a portico, some kind of open workshop. Maybe there'd be gates or doors that would open up, and then they put their wares on display. So let's say you have a shoemaker or something, not unlike that's actually what's here behind you, and they've got all the things that they produce and where they make their stuff at the ground floor, and then they live upstairs. Oftentimes the ground floor also would be for storage, right? So this is typical of the architecture. And this is stuff you should be writing down. This is part, when I stop and I record and I'm going on about these things, it's because you'll be tested on it. It's part of the course. So, I know we're jumping around different subject matters. I've talked about the materials, but now I'm talking about functionality and how you'll be able to recognize the medieval era because you often see remnants of what were a workshop or some kind of display store open to the ground floor, and then they lived upstairs. So that's probably what this was. And again, there's countless other examples to be found. And we'll see on another day when we walk through Trastevere, we'll see some good examples. Okay, we've continued a few steps to the charming little piazza of the church, the little church of Santa Barbara, whose name you can see. Definitely go in there sometime. It's just really beautiful little church. And interesting thing about it, and for me anyway, is that the altar you can see is clearly a marble tablet. It's a piece of marble from ancient Rome that was with a column, piece of a column supporting it, and that's the altar, right? And the other reason I stopped here, I made the same recommendation to your friends on Monday. You see where it says filete di bacala. Bacala is codfish, right? And what that is a fried fish joint, and this is Rome of 7 generations kind of stuff, like the old Romans. It's been here forever. It's a traditional joint, and what they do is they have tables outside, and you get this big, nice piece of fried fish that you basically just eat with your hands, and a few other very simple things. That's all they have, And I recommend that if you want to come to a typical Roman place for some food, right? And so they only have the tables. They've got tables indoors too, but outdoors. So, and obviously they're not open this time of day, but at night. So you come back. So now we're in Piazza Mattei. There's the name of the piazza if you want to take a picture of that. And this fountains. So once again, although the overall theme of the route that we're taking is Republican Rome, it's just inevitable that we come across other things, and I need to tell you about them. And keep in mind that timeline, that mental timeline, and really it should be a physical written timeline that you keep the categories because we're jumping around all the time. There's just, this is the only way that we can go forward. You have to kind of take it all in and divide it up as you go along, all right, into its proper era. So, thinking of the things that we did last week and the descriptions from the beginning of the course, taking a look at this fountain, what era do you think it's from? I mean, you can exclude certainly a few things. What can we exclude? Yeah, that's good. Definitely, it's not fascist era. That's for sure. Is it more recent or older? Do you think?
I think Baroque.
Yeah, Baroque is good. Yeah, the Baroque. It's got a Baroque aspect to it, and you got these Maenids, as they're called, these bronze, kind of very lithe, almost female, but male nudes in these kind of turning and twisting poses. And what is it called? What do you see at the top? Tortoises. And it's called the Fountain of the... Oh, here's, of course, naturally, as soon as we get here, we always see the trash men making their noise. So yeah, it's the Fountain of the Tortoises, right? And it's not exactly Baroque, although of course there are Baroque elements. What are the Baroque elements? The curviness, but like specifically, what are the objects that you can see that have some of that?
All the little cup kind of things.
Yeah, these containers of the water that are like almost like seashells, really. Then you have these little kind of sea figures, these fish, the Maenids, the male figures, and then the tortoises on top.
Can I ask you
A question, yeah.
Since the male figures are more like feminine-like and like their stature and everything, would that be indicative of Baroque? Like they're not like super masculine men.
Okay, that's a great question that Haley made regarding the fact that they're kind of effeminate style men. Is that specifically an indicator of the Baroque? And the answer is no, because in fact there are a lot, because you have different kinds of male ideal, just like you have different kinds of female ideal, and one would be, you could say, Herculean or like a wrestler or something. But then you also have the more lithe and thin. A great example is Donatello's David, which is in Florence. And Donatello is the 15th century, the 1400s, and his David is extremely lithe and almost effeminate. But muscular to a degree, but certainly not a powerful muscular figure like a Michelangelo, right? So that's from the 1400s. So that answers the question. Looking for what defines a certain period, not necessarily the style of the musculature. So they're lithe. However, having said that, having kind of a more dramatic fluidity to how it's moving, with the arms moving around and stuff, that's closer to the Baroque. And in fact, this fountain is designed by a sculptor and architect named Giacomo della Porta. So write that down. Giacomo is Jack, right? Giacomo della Porta. Porta means door. Porta. Giacomo della Porta. And he's not the Baroque, but he is the late Renaissance. And so from those terms, Renaissance, late Renaissance, Baroque, if I say late Renaissance, what date do you think that would be? What period of years? Late 1500s, that's exactly it. And this period we consider a transition from Renaissance to Baroque. And it has its own name, which, again, it's not a political period. it's a stylistic term, and it's called mannerism. Manner, just like the word good manners, mannerism. So mannerism is a kind of a stylistic change going towards Baroque, meaning more and more what? As opposed to, remember the Renaissance is more linear, more severe. So as we approach mannerism, what was there probably more of that is like the Baroque?
Curvy stuff.
Yeah, the curvy stuff is a nice way to put it. That's a simple way to put it. Yeah. And just as a small parenthesis, we'll get into it at another time, some historians would consider that mannerism in fact begins with Michelangelo, but late Michelangelo. And late Michelangelo can be found also in the Sistine Chapel, the Last Judgment. Because in Michelangelo's Last Judgment, these dramatic figures that are portrayed there are twisting and turning, right? So just as a brief thing, write this down though, it's important. Michelangelo worked in the Sistine Chapel in two distinct periods, when he was younger and when he was older. Okay, so there's two different works by Michelangelo in the Sistine Chapel. And it was the late Michelangelo that was that's considered kind of a prelude to mannerism. Okay? So now, after Michelangelo's death, the late 1500s, 1590s, Giacomo della Porta designs this fountain. Although specifically the tortoises are added later. But it's a great example of what's considered mannerist, that transition from Renaissance to Baroque. Okay? And the last thing, I pointed this out also Monday, a nice combination of different marbles. Notice there's different materials in there. And bronze, that's unusual about it, the bronze statues. So let me turn my guy off here. For those listening at home, sorry, there was the cycling truck doing their junk here, but what are you going to do? Okay, now we are in what is called the Jewish ghetto. Okay, so where does the word ghetto come from? Of course, what that meant was it was a designated area where Jews were permitted to live. And in fact, for centuries, it had a wall around it. Right? Now, this is an area that comes out of the Middle Ages. So here we're in a period of the church reigning supreme, and of course Catholicism is the religion, so led by the Pope. So naturally, a counter narrative religion would not be looked upon particularly with any favor. So that's part of the reason for this exclusion, as well as others that are, that's a whole nother massive history. Religious practices and whatever. So there was a wall around it, and they had to live here. Now, as opposed to ancient Rome, when of course there were Jews and countless other religious and ethnic minorities, and they lived for the most part in Trastevere. So it's believed anyway, as far as we know, the earlier, so it wouldn't have been called a ghetto, but an earlier Jewish neighborhood would have, from ancient Roman times, would have been in Trastevere. And this restaurant, I can't remember what it's called, but I've been in it, where you go downstairs, there's this wonderful room that they use as a wine cave, which was believed to have been a synagogue. It's a brick room, and of course, like everywhere else, the ground level is significantly lower, so today you go down into it, right? Oh yeah, this is a quiz term, ghetto, and I explained this on Monday as well. Of course, there's no one knows for sure where that term might comes from, but a reasonable explanation is the following. Venice, of course, is a extremely prosperous and successful city-state, the Republic of Venice, which I hope you'll all visit. And there's a ghetto that you can visit there too, which is still, just like this one, inhabited by Jews, by Italian Jews. And there's some nice tour you can do of some of the old synagogues there and so on. And again, there they had a designated area. Immortalized by Shakespeare with The Merchant of Venice. But where does that term come from? Well, one theory is that near where that Jewish quarter was, there was the mint where they produced the coins of the Republic. And the term for casting those coins is getto, like a getto of bronze. Getto, gettare, ghetto. So it could be a corruption of some kind of the fact that that was the defining feature of the neighborhood, that there was the mint. So from getto to ghetto is a possible. So it specifically meant that specific area where they were allowed to live. And that's a reasonable explanation as to the name, which of course in the modern era has taken on, probably a more negative term. Okay. Now we've come down to the Lungotevere along the river, the Tiber, and we have here the Pons Fabricius, in Italian the Ponte Fabrizio, the bridge of Fabrice, I guess, Fabrizio. So you want to remember the Latin first. Pons is bridge, P-O-N-S. Fabricius is just like you see there. It's actually spelled, I don't need to spell for you, F-A-B-R-I-C-U-S. He was a authority in the 1st century BC, which is what period?
What?
The 1st century BC, what period do we call that?
Empire.
No, it's not the empire. Republic. It's Republican Rome. Right? 1st century BC. Fabricius was an inspector of roads and bridges. So, having that role, he was charged with the building of this bridge. And in fact, the inscription relates to his contribution. Right? So, Pons Fabricius, and in Italian, Ponte Fabrizio. Fabrizio is just the Italianized name of Fabricius. So, it connects to the Isola Tiberina, Tiberina for the Tiber. Right? And beyond it, the island divides, separates the river into two parts. The opposite side, there's another bridge with a different name that leads to Trastevere. So after we're done, for example, you can come back this way and walk across. And in the middle, the island, of course, is part of this geography, which can help us understand why the Romans would settle here. So here we have the geography, which helps us understand the history, because in fact, why would Rome be here? Why not somewhere else? Okay. One important factor is the 7 hills of Rome, which we'll go into starting next week. These hills are natural outcroppings and practical as a settlement and a fortress. Why do you want to be high up on the hill as opposed to down in the valley below? You want to be on the high ground for a lot of reasons, not just flooding. Your enemies are coming. You want to be able to see them and that kind of thing. So the earliest settlements were on these hills, and we'll get into that another time. Another reason is the river is not easy to cross in a prehistoric period, and even in a Republican period. The river floods. It's fast. It's not necessarily practical. So, what helps you get across the river quickly? The fact that there is a,
Bridge.
Well, before there's a bridge, there's an island. The island cuts the length of the river into 2 halves. So this little bit and then the other bit, and they could just go across with a ferry boat. We know that there was in the Republican period, and perhaps even earlier, wooden bridges. That's related in some histories. So temporary bridges, a wooden bridge, you could burn it down or knock it apart if trouble was on the way. Okay. And in the prehistoric Rome, the Rome of the monarchy and early Republican Rome, the city's extent ended here. The Trastevere part was not yet part of Rome and beyond it. So it was a boundary in early Rome as well. Okay? But now, because it's an easy place to cross, it naturally contributes to this being a place for settlement. And another reason, salt. There was a salt route. Salt being mined or being gathered at the ocean and coming in and being distributed throughout these inland areas. Why is salt so important in an early period? it's a preservative. Salt is a preservative. So there was a salt route that came through here, the island, the hills. All of these reasons contribute to this being a practical place for a settlement, right? So that's a little bit of the very early Roman settlement, right? Now, what's the bridge made out of? You can tell. Do you remember the two materials I've mentioned now that you have on your list? You should be able to recognize them. The dark green volcanic stone and the whitish, creamy, porous stone, both of them quarried in the area around Rome. What are they called? Tufa. Which one is tufa?
The green one.
The green one. And then the whitish one that's also right here at our feet? Made the call?
Travertine.
Travertine, right. So remember, somewhere in your notes, go on some back page and start having some groupings, some categories for gods, for deities, for materials, and we've made the categories of art. You're going to have all those categories. So I just want to throw them out as we do, and you just keep listing them. Right? And the sophistication of it, the clean lines and very accurate circles and so on, or rather arches, show us again the sophistication already in the 1st century BC, in the Republican period, and even earlier than that. So we've seen it with the sacred area of Largo Argentina. We see it here. So again, this is focusing on Republican Rome and early Rome. These are great examples, and this is an exceptionally beautiful one. This is the oldest surviving bridge in Rome. Now, the island has a story. Let's go down a little bit more here. Oh, did I forget my bottle somewhere, or did I put it in here? No, I've got it in here. That's good. I hope you've taken some pictures. This is nice here, bathed in the sun. You can see the tufa below the brick. The brick was probably added later. And the guardrail on the top where you see the brick, that's also not from ancient Rome either. Now let's go just a little bit further right here. Okay, we can see a church. So here on the Tiberine Island, in the Republican period, quite early, 4th or 3rd century, I'd have to double check to remember the specific date, but a temple was founded to the god Asclepius. Okay, so this is important. Your list of gods, you're going to have one of those too, right? We've talked today about the god of fortune, and I talked about the very different aspects. We saw her temple. Right, one of her temples. Here, the god Asclepius, the god of medicine, the god of healing. Asclepius is spelled Aesclepius, Asclepius. Okay? Aesclepius, Asclepius. Okay? And on the resource page for both courses, I've included a copy of the passage, the entry from Lempriere's Classical Dictionary. So there's a definition of Asclepius, which is for your Google map and for the exam. When I go into important gods and stuff, so far that's what I've been doing. So the goddess of fortune and the goddess and the god Asclepius are both on your resource page. So look those up and perhaps copy them or do something, use them to enrich your Google Map page, okay, for week 2. Because remember, the Google Maps layers, you can have a layer for each week, I think. I'm not sure if we're going beyond 10 weeks. I mean, that might be one way of organizing it. Anyway, Asclepius, why is his temple here? Why here and why not somewhere else? Well, one reason is probably a practical reason. When people are sick, what do you want them? You want them around you? What do they do generally? Yeah, you isolate them. So being on an island, if people are sick, is not a bad idea, right? But the legend is otherwise. The legend is in the 4th century BC, I think it was, Rome was suffering a plague. And we know how plagues and pestilence, how unpleasant those can be. What did they do to try to resolve this? They sent out an embassy, and they sent this embassy to the Temple of Asclepius in Greece. So here you have another good example of this, Greece being such an important source, not just for the art and architecture, but for the religion and the religious figures, the god that embodies health, Asclepius. What do they bring back from this embassy, this visit? They bring back a snake, and the snake is the symbol of Asclepius. Now, why would a snake be the symbol of Asclepius? Think about the nature of the snake. Why would the snake be a symbol? And it still is. If you look at the medical symbol, the American Medical Association and doctors' symbols, it's a staff with intertwining snakes. Why the snake? What does the snake do? What are its characteristics? Can you think of anything? What does it do every year, for example, as it grows? It sheds its skin, so it renews. It's renewed. That's what you want with health, right? You want renewal. That's a big reason. And another reason is the famous characteristic of the venom. The venom can be processed, and what can it become? It can become the antidote. It can be transformed into an antidote. So the sickness, the antidote could be pulled out of the source of the sickness. So the snake, the sacred snake, was brought back. It was released on the shore of the Tiber, and it slithered into the water and swam to the island. And that legend, that's why they then built the temple to Asclepius there. Okay? So a little bit of the legend, a practical reason also, that isolation, all of that kind of adds up to why it's here. Interestingly, there is a hospital on the right half of the island. It's still a hospital. It's always been a center of health. Okay? My wife's best friend, she had her baby in that hospital. I remember we visited her after a couple days. Now, another interesting thing, and this just popped into my head on Monday, and I'll share it with you today. The church is dedicated to St. Bartholomew. St. Bartholomew. And we'll see St. Bartholomew portrayed in Michelangelo in The Last Judgment. St. Bartholomew suffered a terrible death. He was skinned alive. And it only occurred to me when I started talking about it the other day, think of that. The snake, the symbol of health, the snake sheds its skin. And here we have a saint, of all the saints you could have picked, who's skinned alive. So it's just an interesting little thing I noticed. Okay. If you visit the island, and it's certainly worth walking around, this whole front part that faces south, it's long, almost like a ship, and in fact we can't see it, but just at the base of the church there, over here where I'm pointing, you can see a little bit of the white wall through the trees, and that is actually a remnant from that same, probably the same, it's believed the same time as the bridge, at least the 1st century BC, of kind of a ship's prow, the front of a ship, as if the island is a kind of a ship. And sculpted into that prow, and if you don't go there, you can just look at it on photos on the internet, can be seen a snake, and can be seen a bearded figure, the god Asclepius. Okay? So the bridge reminds us of Rome's expertise, the engineering. The island shows the continuity of religious practice and social practice regarding health. Now, one last thing that I mentioned, I don't remember when I mentioned it on Monday, but it's important that I mention it here. I mentioned, I believe, Vitruvius on last week as the singular important source of architecture. Right? So he's the 1st century AD. He's not long after this. But remember that figure because it's the most famous name we have. And he discusses all these various different architectural projects from a Roman point of view from that time. So Vitruvius is fundamental to Roman architectural history and as well as the Renaissance, as we'll see. Okay? And I think I included also a small entry from Lempriere to Vitruvius on the resource page as well. Okay, I'm going to stop there. But you also take notes, so you got to kind of do both. But, just kind of do your best. So an important thing that you do need to write down that just like last week, I forgot to mention it earlier, but it's fundamental. The area that we've been in, from the sacred area of Largo Argentina all the way to here, and then actually extending north beyond Argentina to the Pantheon and elsewhere. This area, the Romans called it the Field of Mars. The Field of Mars. And who is Mars? A god. You know what he's the god of? The angry red planet should help.
Mars bars.
Mars bars, the god of Mars bars. Mars is shown wearing armor, a helmet, weapons. He's the god of war. Okay? Another god for your categories. All right? So the Field of Mars, presumably, if this calling it a field means obviously it had a very different aspect than we see today. There was a lot of, in fact, in the earliest period, it was marshy because of the vicinity of the river, but it was also a large open space as opposed to the Roman Forum area that we'll be visiting, which was the urbanized area. So this area was further away from the city center in the Republican period, but of course it got progressively more and more built up. But since it was an open space, what do you think they did here if they called it the Field of Mars? I mean, was this a place for training? Yeah, military practice. That probably has most of the reason to do with it. In fact, you can go to this day, the area around the Eiffel Tower in Paris is called the Champ de Mars, which literally is the same thing. That's the French for the Field of Mars, and that was where military exercises took place back in Napoleonic times, right? And French Revolution in that era. So that's the connotation. Now, eventually, where we are, in that period, there was a circus. And the circus is a place for races, competitions, horse races. It has to be lengthy, right? And this circus was called the Flaminian Circus. Flaminian. The Via Flaminia is a road that heads north. As far as I know, it's the same, perhaps the same figure that it derives its name from. But this circus, being a very long racetrack, where we're standing, if you look back at this this facade of the synagogue, imagine that this would have been one end of the circus, and at least 2 to 3 lengths of that going north, as I'm indicating. So this large circus from near the river to at least where we're standing and extending north. So there was a huge racetrack, okay, in ancient Rome, the Flaminian Circus. Circus meaning circuit, right? And facing this circus, so this circus, maybe it had grandstands, maybe they were temporary, maybe it was just a large open space that was tamped down dirt. It would depend on the period, but obviously, as you can see, there's nothing that we can see of it. I mean, there may be elements of it to be found underground. And now, also facing it from the side is the Portico of Octavia. Portico of Octavia. So portico is self-explanatory. A portico is a covered walkway, very practical, provides shade, places for people to meet, and it's a kind of a fancy gateway. So the front of it here, the facade with its, what's the triangular part called on top? Tympany or tympanum. Tympanum. That's it. Good. And what we're looking at is the central portion that extended, that protruded out, and then it was flanked on either side by a long series of columns. which was the portico. And then entering inside of it, there were a couple small temples inside of it, and there was on display a great deal of art. So again, this art, especially imported through military conquest. This was a very typical practice of ancient Rome, where Greek works of art were confiscated through war, and then of course they ultimately purchase it and have copies made and stuff. So statues of gods, statues of heroes, things like that, statues from mythical tales, any number of themes, but they would have been on display in that court. So imagine a large public area, covered walkways, a couple temples inside, probably some fountains. So a very monumental and beautiful architectural space. Now let's go a little closer to it. Okay, Octavius, or rather Octavia, excuse me, is the sister of the Emperor Augustus. The Emperor Augustus, so what period are we in?
Empire.
The Roman Empire. There you go. So that, and Augustus, so you'll familiarize yourself over time with various emperors and their eras, and Augustus is the end of the first, this is important, end of the 1st century BC, beginning of the 1st century AD. So it's that switch over from the two, which is the time of Augustus, right?
When was it?
The end of the BC period, the beginning of the AD period is the time of the Emperor Augustus. So Augustus names this monumental gateway for his sister Octavia, right? This is you could say, an aristocratic royal family. That's where it gets its name. However, we can tell that this was actually restored, like so many things in Rome, by later emperors because their name's on it. So look at the upper left inscription and take a picture of it eventually, take a close-up. It says Imp, I-M-P, Imp, that's the abbreviation for emperor, Imperator, and in this case it says Imp, right? And then next to that, C-A-E-S for Cesare, Caesar, Imperator Caesar. Now Caesar is not specifically Julius Caesar, it's his name, but it comes to take on a name of a title, right? So Imperator Caesar. And then you can see a little bit of his name. It's partly covered over, but it says Septimius Severus. Can you see where it says Severus? S-E-V-E-R-U-S. But the U, of course, is shaped like a V. The first part says Septimius. So write this down. It's an important emperor, Septimius Severus. Or yeah, take a good S-E-P-T-I-M-I-U-S. Septimius. And then severe, just like severe, Severus, right? So he was emperor around the end of the 2nd century AD, around 200 AD, okay? Septimius Severus. And he obviously restored this, maybe due to a fire or earth, I'm not specifically sure why, but clearly he left his name in his inscription because he restored it. So that's a common practice, okay? And it'll be interesting in a minute, you'll see the indication of that restoration. But before we do that, let's step over here to this little walkway. Just so you can once again get an idea, and you might take a picture of this dramatic difference in the ground levels. Ancient Rome at a much lower level than the Rome of today. Okay, so here too we have a clearing out of older medieval buildings during the fascist era that revealed this archaeology, and our final stop today, which we'll be talking about briefly later, the theater of Marcellus. Okay, but it's a nice indication of this dramatic change in the level. And now let's descend. So I've mentioned a lot how there's in later eras, the medieval era and on, they're always recycling and reusing the materials. But that kind of practice begins in ancient Rome itself, which, that tells us something about, their economy. Instead of importing some fancy marble of Rome, if you're just reusing stuff, why might they be doing that? It's cheaper. Maybe they were poorer. Maybe there was less security. The weakening of the trade routes. Maybe there were more pirates. Maybe it got, you know, any number of reasons could lead to it. But what's interesting is you can see this recycling. Look at that inner. See, of course, it's hidden, but can you see all those fragments, pieces of columns and other cornices from perhaps the earlier version of the building, and they just turned them around and reused them there. So that's a good example of recycling, and that is from the time of Septimius Severus. Okay? That's when this was redone. So that is practically 200 years after Augustus. And take a bunch of pictures of these panels, because you get an idea of, see, here's the Circus Flaminius in this model, in this picture. It just shows you a large open area, and then the portico, just as exactly as I described. Hopefully my description gels with what you see here to some extent, okay? And then the Theater of Marcellus, and then this large open area of the so-called circus, okay? And then the island, of course, and the bridge, right? So yeah, take a bunch of pictures of that, and remember, use those, and then find more. You know, hopefully you look online and you'll find even nicer examples. And here too, the same thing. If you want to take a couple photos here, that's a good frontal image of and the architectural plan of the portico as well. And then the medieval era, when before any of the restoration was done, before it was all dug up. And like so much of Rome, look at the foundation. What's the difference? What can you use your eyes to try to make a deduction. What's the difference between what you see here and what's here? What's happened? And what we're looking at is a panel and then an interior area. Take a picture of it. And why is there the difference?
Panel is newer, like just to cover up all of the rocks and stuff.
Yeah, the panel, well, it's not that it's newer, but it is covering it up. This is the cement foundation, and then it's embellished, it's decorated with some nice marble that covers it up. So this is typical of the Romans. You know, you're not going to make a foundation out of solid, expensive marble. You're going to use the cheap stuff to create the cement foundation, and then you're going to cover it with paneling. So that's what you're looking at. And this is the practice throughout the centuries. And now extending southwards, the side of the portico with the foundation that was found, some of the columns put back up, and we can see the corner here, okay? So let's walk down towards the corner to the Theater of Marcellus. Okay, we're walking along towards the rebuilt corner of the Temple of Mars and the Theater of Marcellus. Okay, we'll stop here so we can stay in the shade. Just come over here in front of me. Come over here in front of me. So this temple is dedicated to Apollo. And Apollo is, of course, another famous god. A god of the hunt, the god of the sun, god of music. And specifically, compared to others, a uniquely Greek god as far as his identity goes. So wholly imported. And the temple, again, like so many others, was restored and rebuilt many times. So we see the columns that were set back up in the fascist era. That was when this was all uncovered. And behind me here, the Theater of Marcellus. So the Theater of Marcellus is a nephew of the Emperor Augustus. He was a favored nephew and being groomed ultimately to take over, but he died prematurely. And this leads us to just a brief parenthesis about that period. The Roman Empire, as told in the books by Robert Graves, so write this down, keep track of this. He wrote a great novel, couple of novels about the Emperor Claudius, I Claudius, right? And then Claudius the God. Claudius was an emperor. And you can check out, if you have the interest, the BBC series from the 1970s, which is long. It's like a 10-part series with the greatest British actors of their generation. And one of the early episodes recount this story of the Emperor Augustus and the family and the scheming that's going on, the backstabbing and the assassinations, the murders. And one of the theories of that time is that it was in fact Augustus' wife Livia that had these relatives such as Marcellus poisoned to clear the path for her son from her previous marriage, Tiberius. And Tiberius, in fact, did become the emperor after Augustus, because conveniently, just about everybody that was related to Augustus that could have become emperor had died. Right? So that's part of the reason. It was perhaps maybe a little too convenient that all these other people had gotten sick and died, paving the way for Tiberius. But the BBC series, I Claudius, is an excellent introduction to, this aristocratic life. And it also reminds us and shows us how in this empire and the vast wealth that there was, right? The success of the empire meant that these people have the time to be scheming and backstabbing and living in these fancy villas on the top of these hills and so on. They're not off, dropping their plows and running off to fight some war against another local power. So it shows you, perhaps the danger of decadence and the danger of that massive wealth that Rome had become in the empire, right? So we saw the site of the Theater of Pompey, where all that remains that reminds us of it is the curved building built on top. Here we see the actual theater, right? Another freestanding theater. And included on the resource page are some nice materials that I uploaded that I expect you to, again, use in your Google Maps that show it as it would have looked, right? So this is a reminder of the sophistication and how complicated the stagecraft was, the number of people holding, 18, 20,000 people and so on. And the whole story specifically of theater as part of the culture, actors and so on, I'm going to go into next week, at the beginning of the class next week, because it's, again, like we've had that chunk about religion. We're going to do a chunk about theater and then other activities, culture activities, so as to the why it's here, what it was used for. But we'll go into that another time. Last couple things I'll say about it today is, like so much of Rome, of course, it was reused, and you see a Renaissance era palace built into the top. So nothing is left of the interior because it was completely reused to build this palatial residence. And the Colosseum, another odd century or so later, clearly owes a massive debt to this in its style of its building. Okay. So I'm going to stop here, I think. Let me see.